Welcome to Slayer the Alchemist, and on today's episode, let's discuss the First Testament album, The Legacy. I'm still on my debut album kick. I did a video a couple days ago, Motorhead, the first self-titled Motorhead record. And I've really been getting into this album. This is an album that I haven't listened to in a long time. And a couple things struck me as I was listening to this album. For me, Testament, their sound, at least like during this era, lands for me somewhere between Slayer and Metallica. They're not quite as aggressive as Slayer. They're not quite as dark sounding as Slayer. But they're also not quite, especially when I'm talking early Metallica, that sort of new wave of British heavy metal influence on like the first Metallica record especially. I hear this as being a little bit more like some kind of cross between Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets era Metallica, and Rain in Blood from Slayer, or maybe a little earlier Slayer, Show No Mercy, Haunting the Chapel, that kind of era of Slayer, kind of combining those two things. But it's interesting that Testament never quite achieved the popularity that any of the big four bands, Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Anthrax, did. And I think part of that is a timing thing. And I often think about this with bands that, and I could probably make a video on this, like bands that if they had just released their first record or their seminal album a little bit earlier, maybe their careers, or at a different time, maybe their careers would have taken a different trajectory. And I often think of that with Testament, because this album came out in April of '87. And by this point, Metallica had already released Master of Puppets. Slayer had already released Rain in Blood. Megadeth had released Peace Sells already. And Anthrax, just a couple months, like a month, I think, before this, had released Among the Living. And imagine if this album had been released before Master of Puppets, or right around the same time as Metallica's first record, first or second record. I really think it might have changed the way Testament is viewed. Maybe they would have been one of the big four, maybe knocking out one of the other bands, because this is a really, really good record, and I really like this record. It's got a certain atmosphere to it. As I mentioned earlier, it's kind of like somewhere between Slayer and Metallica for me. So it has that dark element of Slayer, but it also has the riffing style and the songwriting style in some ways of Master of Puppets, Ride the Lightning era, Metallica. So I really like that. I like the production on this record. It's produced by Alex Perealis, who had done a bunch of thrash metal albums, Kill 'Em All, Fistful of Metal. So I like the vibe on this record. It's got some reverb on it that gives it this atmosphere that I really like. Another thought that I had as I was revisiting this record, was how great of a guitar player Alex Skolnick is. I always knew he was a great guitar player, but listening to this, in some ways, he might be my favorite guitar player of these thrash metal bands, the Big Four and Exodus and Testament and those bands, because he has the technique, but when he solos, he's a very melodic soloist. You can tell that he's very aware of like what the chord changes are going on underneath him, whereas Kirk Hammett sometimes just sounds like he's just kind of wailing away on a scale. You can tell that Alex is really picking his notes so that it fits these thrash type chord progressions, which are often very chromatic and sort of move around and can be slightly dissonant. So you get Alex playing these scales that are, for you guitar players out there, the Phrygian scales, that Ritchie Blackmore, Randy Rhoads kind of classical sounding scale thing. You hear him doing that, for instance, on the opening track, Over the Wall, one of my favorite pieces on this. And one of the ones I believe they had a video for. You can hear him playing this sort of Ritchie Blackmore, Snake Charmer, Phrygian thing in the mid part of the song with his guitar solo when it's sort of the tempo changes on everything. So yeah, those are and Chuck Billy's vocals in this earlier part of Testament, earlier years of Testament, he's, in my opinion, more melodic. And again, he's sort of somewhere between Tom Araya and James Hetfield with his vocal style. And as Testament went on, especially in the 2000s, it seems like there's less melody in their playing, in their vocals and melody lines. And maybe that's why I'm not as much into Testament in the last so many years. I really have to go back, and it's really just the first so many records that I like from them or really get into from them. And I think that's one of the reasons why is that Chuck Billy, his vocals are more melodic on this earlier stuff. Interestingly, I didn't know this until I was researching for this video. He only gets one writing credit on this album, Chuck Billy, and it's on Do or Die, and that's because Steve Setro Sousa was the original singer in Testament, or was the singer before Chuck Billy came into the band. And Setro would go on to be with Exodus, starting with their Pleasures of the Flesh record, and so he gets a writing credit on pretty much every song except Do or Die on this particular album. There's a lot of songs I like on here. Again, it's sort of that dark atmosphere that appeals to me, like The Haunting. It's got, again, this Slayer type of vibe. I love the technical riffs, like these riffs that are just sort of moving up and down the fingerboard, almost atonal at times. The way it moves around, I really like that. Burnt Offerings, that's another one. I love these song titles; they're just great. The moody intro to that one, the heavy part. There's a heavy part that comes around that really makes me think of Metallica. The fast Megadeth style verse riffing. Again, there's a little bit of Megadeth mixed in here. Maybe Killing Is My Business era Megadeth. You hear that. Raging Waters, that's another one I really like. I like the way they shout Devil's Triangle. Maybe they should have titled that one Devil's Triangle. Slayer-like vocals in that one for me. Curse of the Legions of Death. This is interesting. If you look on streaming versions of this record, it's listed as Curse of the Legions of Death, yet on the album here, it's just abbreviated COTLOD. It's way cooler to just call it Curse of the Legions of the Death. Why they did that, I have no idea. Alone in the Dark, that's a cool one with the melodic chorus. I really like that. I will say that the second side of this record, when you get into First Strike is Deadly. What else? Do or Die. It gets a little fatiguing. There's not enough, I wish there was a little bit more variety. Again, let's use Master of Puppets as an example. Welcome Home Sanitarium, The Thing That Should Not Be. Things that were a little bit slower, added a little bit of that mood, because the constant, fast up-tempo stuff, it starts to get a little fatiguing by the time you get to the second side. But again, Alone in the Dark, I like the chorus in that one. It's very catchy. There's some melody. It's melodic there. And Apocalyptic City, the album closes out on that, and that one's really cool. I like the short little pseudo-classical guitar intro thing. I wish there was a little bit more of that kind of stuff on here. So a really strong record. I love this album cover too. Really strong album. I can't help but when I listen to this though to think that, man, if this had come out 2 or 3 years earlier, you could say the same thing with Exodus, Bonded by Blood. If that, and I don't remember exactly the story with that. I think they recorded it and it was sort of delayed. And if that had just come out a year earlier, same thing with this. It just had come out a couple years earlier. I wonder if it would have changed the career of Testament, and people would have viewed them in a different way, because you can't help but, when you listen to this, think of Master of Puppets, think of Peace Sells, think of Rain and Blood. And those albums had all come out before this album did. But as it stands, I really like it. I really love Alex Skolnick's I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right. His guitar playing is just fantastic. I've seen Testament twice. They were on the 70,000 Tons of Metal cruise, I believe, the first year. So that was cool. But again, the later era Testament stuff doesn't appeal to me as much as the earlier era Testament stuff does. So, okay, there you go. Testament, The Legacy, another debut album. Let me know what you guys think of it in the comments down below. Till we see you again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.